A very good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the BBA's webinar channel where we discuss the latest issues impacting and affecting banks and regulated firms alongside subject matter experts in the field. My name is Philip Allen, Director of Learning at the BBA, and today for the next hour to discuss are you ready to certify your staff as fit and proper, I'm delighted to be joined this hour by Simon Hills, the BBA's Executive Director of Prudential Capital, Risk and Regulatory Relationships, Julie Pardy, Lead Consultant of BBA Associate Member Firm WorkSmart, and Simon Collins, Managing Director of the Financial Services Regulatory Compliance Practice within Evershed Consulting. Just before I hand over to Simon, you can participate in this webinar in two ways. Firstly, by asking questions. If you have a question for the presenter, you can ask a question at any time simply by clicking on an Ask the Question button on your screen, which is located underneath the presentation. Please note that when you ask a question, your name and your organisation is not disclosed to any other webinar attendees. Number two, we would also invite you to participate in our Ask the Audience poll questions. To participate in the poll is very simple. A pop-up box with the question will appear on your screen. Simply answer the question in the box and click OK. We intend to present for 40 minutes and then answer your questions for the remaining 20 minutes. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. And I think the senior manager's regime is now embedded. We've overcome the day one challenge of being ready for the 7th of March implementation date, and we've moved on to more of a business as usual approach, albeit that there are still a number of outstanding challenges. And one of those is getting ready to assess our certified colleagues as being fit and proper. And that's the topic of today's webinar, and thanks to our colleagues from WorkSmart and Evershed for making this happen. But before we kick off, a reminder that there are a number of open consultations out from the PRA and the FCA, which we at the BBA are in the process of responding to. They look at extending the rules of conduct regime to notified or standard NEDs, by which I mean in our parlance ordinary NEDs. The PRA and the FCA use different terminology for those ordinary NEDs. Guidance, which I think is quite helpful on the duty of responsibility, and a cocktail of amendments from the PRA, including the introduction of a prescribed function which requires someone to be responsible for the operational continuity and systems and technology of the bank, and also some helpful thoughts from the PRA and the FCA on their experience about what constitutes good statements of responsibility, good responsibility maps. I'm finalising those responses now, so do please get in touch with me if you've got any particular thoughts. And just an adversary that on Monday afternoon we're having one of our regular industry get-togethers at which participants can raise questions and share experiences. That's happening at the BBA on Monday afternoon. So do get in touch with me if you have issues that you would like me to raise. But now, Julie, let's move on to the meat of today's discussion. How do we get ready to certify our colleagues as being fit and proper?
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for that. Right, okay, so I'm going to take the next 15 or so minutes to work through some slides with you and talk about certification in general. Now, what you should be seeing coming up on your slide deck now is the date, past and future. Now, it's probably fair to say that all firms that have been affected by SMCR have actually been on quite a journey over the last 12 to 18 months as they sought to implement requirements as effectively as possible. But our focus in Maine today is not going to be on the deadlines that have already passed, although you will see those obviously on the screen in front of you, but we're going to be thinking about the future and about certification and the activities associated with this. Now, obviously we're all aware that we'll shortly be hitting this certification deadline in March 2017, and we really want to consider certification in the round and the challenges that exist for firms in implementing it. Now, one of the things that we always find on a broadcast of this type is that people really want to be able to benchmark themselves against what other organisations are doing and just see if they're there or thereabouts in terms of their interpretation and implementation. So what we will try and seek to do today is, as we go through the slides and we talk through the different elements of this webinar, we'll talk about maybe some lessons learned that have come up over the last year, and also typically what we see firms doing when we're out there working with them, either advising them on this regime or working with them from a software and systems perspective. So, certification. Plan to spend about 10 minutes or so on this, maybe a little longer. And what we're going to do is we're just going to look at some areas maybe that are typical challenges, typical concerns. We're going to try and not spend too much time on facts that you already know and that you're already aware of, but we just will pick up a few key points that we think are relevant or where we've had queries from firms in the past. So, I think it's fair to say at this point in the implementation process that most firms really are clear about how the new certification regime applies to them. However, we think that it's worth taking a moment or two so that we can focus on, firstly, the basis of this new regime, and then what it actually requires of a firm. So, just to be clear, the new certification regime requires firms to assess the fitness and propriety of employees in roles which could pose a risk of significant harm to the firm or any of its customers. Now, it's the firm's responsibility, as you're all well aware, to make individual certification decisions. However, I think it's a point worth noting that the regulators have stated they may well challenge the overall effectiveness of a firm's process. So I think here, when we're looking to decide what our process looks like and who we apply it to, it's about following process, being able to justify the decisions that have been made, and being able to evidence why people might have been out of the regime as well as the ones that you've actually put within it. Now, what you should see on the screen in front of you is a slide there that talks about the 9 specified significant harm functions. But I've just got a few observations and comments to make on this. So, for EEA branches, the CAS significant harm function only applies to branches with a top-up permission. And for the last 2 functions that you see on the slide there, we're obviously all aware that we started off with 7 significant harm functions through consultation, and then through consulting and feedback to the regulator, they expanded to the 9. And the client dealing function and the algorithmic trading function were added on latterly. But just a point to note here, and the only point at which I'll go backward in time rather than forward, is to remind you that you had until the 7th of September this year to identify staff captured under those 2 functions and train them in respect of the new conduct rules. So, we know that a firm should only issue a certificate under certification to an individual when the firm's satisfied that the person is fit and proper to perform any one of the significant harm functions. But how does a firm go about doing this? Well, you can see on the screen, and you will know by now that the guidance laid down in CISC, which can be found, if you're not familiar with it, at 5.2.7, it gives us the details of where a firm's focus should be in terms of the certification assessment. But what we also know is that we've also got the FIT rule book, and that provides us with further information and gives us the main assessment criteria that fits around honesty, integrity, reputation, financial soundness, and so on. But we'll talk a bit more about that later on. Now, the evidence that a firm gathers about an individual is going to be a mixture of hard facts. So, for example, qualifications that people have obtained, whether people have got their statements of professional standing. But it will also be partly driven by some more subjective evidence, for example, an annual performance management grading by a manager. And certification is really all about bringing together a variety of competence indicators to allow a firm to make an objective assessment about a particular individual. Now, we talked about a number of challenges, and firms have raised these continually with us about the regime, and you'll be seeing on your screen 5 areas there, and I'm going to go in a clockwise direction from the right-hand box that talks about day 1 compliance. So So BBA members have been asking for feedback on challenges, and they want to know where they are, as I said before, in relation to their peers. And we've picked on a few points here to discuss with you. So many firms have told us that their key focus has been on day one compliance, and it's been about all those things that Simon talked about earlier, responsibility mapping, allocation of prescribed responsibilities, and so on. Now, when they've come to certification, they've realised that the day two task, such as actually designing and implementing their own in-house certification regime, has actually become one of the most challenging aspects of all, as firms wrestle with process design and system specification. If we think about F&P assessments, previously many firms only undertook detailed F&P assessments for actually quite small numbers of staff. With certification, the number concerned will obviously increase, and there's going to be that ongoing annual requirement. As a result, firms will need to ensure that not only do they have the right resource, but also that they have sufficiently robust systems with which to manage the requirements. If we move on and we think about competence per se, there are many elements to the assessment of competence, and they come in many guises. It's probably fair to expect that all firms have a performance management process that on an annual or more frequent basis tracks the general competence and career progression of individuals. In addition, many firms will also be using a T&C framework that will provide a greater level of tracking and oversight where regulation requires it. Now, the challenge here for firms is to ensure that the evidence from this competence tracking, whether it's performance management or T&C, is fed into the certification process and considered for each individual prior to certification. What firms must ensure is that they've not got conflicting information that's collected in different parts of an organisation. Now, what about what happens when a firm chooses not to certificate somebody or is unable to? We know that if this happens, the firm's got to notify the individual in writing, stating what steps, if there are any, that the firm proposes to take in relation to that person as a result of this, and the reasons for proposing to take the steps. So firms really need to ensure that they've thought about this and they've got a robust process for the management of those people that don't meet the grade. And on the final point of how do we know if we've got our certification population identified correctly, then it's back obviously to CISC again, 5.2 onwards for guidance, but most specifically the definitions that are laid out in 5.29 onwards that go through the 9 significant harm functions and give some further advice to firms. So for the management of my regime, what options exist for firms? Well, certainly we've seen a number of different approaches and viewpoints in firms that we've dealt with, but I think there are some key decisions on the management of the regime that are likely to be these kind of things. So who's going to be responsible for managing the in-house certification process? Is it HR? Is it compliance, operations, or maybe even a combination of both? Or actually, do we go back to the question, who holds the prescribed responsibility for employee certification in your organisation? Because actually, that's probably likely to drive the location and the ownership and the makeup of the team that manage the process. So if we've got a multitude of individuals that have to be certificated annually for one or more of the 9 functions, then firms need to ask themselves, do we have an internal IT solution that can help us manage the complexity of this? Or do we need to look for an external solution? This multifaceted annual assessment will become increasingly difficult to run on an annual basis as time goes by and for those larger populations. And on the final point, the chances are you've probably already got externally implemented systems that manage your training and competence regime, or more broadly, employee competence and performance management. Maybe you can have a look at those. Can they be expanded to help you manage the challenge of the certification regime? If not, then consider investigating an external certification regime management solution that can interact with your existing system. So on that note, we're just going to let you have a look, and I'm going to leave you just for a few seconds looking at the questions that we gathered together for you to ask yourself about certification. Now, as you've been working through your plans, I'm sure you've been considering a very wide range of questions, and we've only got time to put a few up here. I'm not going to go through these one by one, but there is one that I just want to focus on, and that is what are the component parts that will make up your internal certification? Well, actually, from what I've seen, there's a number of differing things that people are using for their evidence. They're using qualifications, they're using annual performance management output, CBS checks obviously are standard, CPD evidence, and for those that are registered with professional bodies, it might even be the issuing of an SDS, T&C data, and even conduct rules breaches. As to what you choose to use, however, the decision is yours. Just be prepared to justify your choices when you've made that decision on what exists for you. Now, let's take a brief look at training and competence. Now, the TC rulebook's been around in one guise or another since the mid-90s, and some people have said to me that they think there's duplication of activity with the new certification regime, specifically for those that already fall under the TC rulebook. Now, I'm not sure I actually agree with that, because I'd suggest that the new certification regime is more of an extension to the wider competence assessment of the individual and a widening of the net of those caught within it. Now, TC, as we know, is a more structured and defined process for managing competence at a very granular level for those roles as defined in the rulebook. But let's just take a moment and have a look. Are these two regimes complementary, or are they competing? Okay, so if we look at T&C, it really is all about employee competence, as I said, at a granular level. Well, actually, exactly the same could be said for certification, although I view it as being the process that oversees all indicators of competence, or lack of it, in its widest sense. Now, we know that TC is applied very specifically to those that provide a range of services to retail clients and have qualification standards to meet. But the certification regime just extends oversight on competence to a wider group of individuals. And it actually now acknowledges that risks to consumers don't just come from customer-facing staff. Now, we know that TC provides a lot of guidance on the structure of firms' frameworks and the competence phases that exist for individuals. But whilst certification is less granular in that particular detail, it does provide the overarching mechanism with which competence might be assessed for role holders. Now, both regimes pick up individuals with qualification requirements and also the managers. I think the challenge here is we know that overall, from our view, that certification and T&C are complementary, but the real challenge is going to be to ensure that the evidence of competence that's captured here is fed through to that fuller competence assessment, and once again, that one does not conflict another. Again, we've come up with a question set here, and I certainly don't plan to go through these in any detail, but I will finish this section with an observation on resourcing for this regime and workflow. For many firms, certification really is quite a challenge in terms of having appropriate resource with which to handle it. And if firms haven't considered how workflow tools might help take the challenge out of implementing certification, then now might be the time to do so. Now, finishing on T&C on that note, what I'd like to do now is hand over to Simon Collins, who's going to pick up and talk about the role of HR, legal and compliance.
Thank you very much indeed, Julie, and it's very nice to join you today. And over the course of the next 10 minutes, I guess, what I'm going to do is just, as Julie's mentioned, look at this role of legal and compliance, and in addition, look at some of the aspects that we've been seeing over the course of the last 18 months and give you a flavour for some of the challenges that we've seen and some of the good practices that we've also seen as well. So the regime has created a need for these three functions, HR, legal and compliance, to be joined up, ensuring consistency across the firm. At Evershares, we've worked with a variety of firms over the course past 18 months, from banks, both overseas and UK, private banks, building society societies and insurers. There's no doubt the role of HR has become far more visible from an overall strategic and implementation perspective. And in probably the majority of cases we've worked on, HR has been the project sponsor. Firms are tending now to be in a BAU phase in the run-up to March 2017. But given the issues that are cropping up, all three pillars are being kept very busy, and in the main, from the evidence we see, in a very collaborative manner, which is vital. In some cases, individuals within the HR team have felt a little exposed and have needed to increase their regulatory knowledge, particularly around CISC and SUP. But again, on the evidence we've seen, HR teams have by and large grasped the opportunity to raise their profile in the organisation. Given the people nature of the regime, we've seen combined efforts in dealing with potentially tricky areas, such as contract revisions and addendums, leavers and joiners, and this extended period it appears to be taking within the recruitment cycle overall. Promotion of whistleblowing and the new requirements encouraging more individuals to speak out if they're concerned about potential issues, such as misconduct or fraud, has again driven increased activity for our three-pillar teams. Getting the board on side has been a vital part of the implementation of the regime in preventing any nasty surprises and getting that necessary buy-in to ensure that all aspects of the regime are covered. It is also fair to say that some boards have wanted greater clarity in getting comfortable with the overall fit and proper process. So, moving on to where firms understandably have changes taking place within their organisation, what I'd like to now just touch on is role changes and new recruits and the various challenges that that brings. We've seen quite a lot of push and pull between business requirements and regulatory HR requirements. This is particularly around CS30 roles and mortgage advisors in trying to fill positions due to the business needs, but not necessarily being able to get the assessments done in time or paperwork finalised that perhaps the business is looking for. And that really does need working closely together to make sure that both parties are aware of their responsibilities. Some firms have found challenges in the consistency of approach across line management interpretation on fit and proper issues, with line managers attaching differing levels of concern, particularly around advisor functions and compliance failings. As Julie mentioned earlier, there's of course a prescribed responsibility for compliance with the certification regime. And the SM responsible, needs that oversight and needs to be comfortable around any potential attestation that may be required in the future. Although a formal handover document in line with the handover policy requirements is not required for certification staff, there is merit going forward in considering adopting such an approach, as we have seen from some firms, from a good business practice angle. Ensuring orderly handovers of critical roles is something all firms need to have. And of course, CISC does make reference to firms making consideration to other parts of a firm's management in maintaining handover. One of the issues that we have tended to find is out-of-date role profiles, not fully describing the role the individual has been asked to do. Given the requirements of Senior Conduct Rule 3 around delegation by senior managers, ensuring those role profiles are accurate and up-to-date is critical. Some firms are finding challenges with the extent of referencing, particularly where individuals may not have a long past record in the FS world. This means making best endeavours in these circumstances to obtain as much relevant information as possible. Again, this is likely to mean extra time to complete the take-on process, which needs to be factored into your overall thinking. However, the repercussions and amount of time needed for sorting out a situation where your referencing is lacking will be far more significant. Final point here is, again, not a formal requirement, use of criminal records checks for certified individuals is generally being followed in our experience. So, we're all concerned, in a sense, in getting fit and proper assessments and getting those right. Next slide that's coming through is going to cover what we've actually been seeing. The new requirements have focused attention, and we've seen some concerns being raised that there is too much over-engineering with F&P approaches. However, the onus is on the firm to get it right. Under CISC 5.2.7, the firm must have regard to whether the individual, as Julie has mentioned, has obtained a qualification, has undergone or is undergoing training, possesses a level of competence, and has the personal characteristics. With firms having more responsibilities, they've been taking their previous appraisal processes, enhancing in line with fit enhancements and the overall SMCR guidance that's been provided. This has not been a 5-minute task. Making sure the criteria of assessment is clear and communicated appropriately is key. Does the certified person understand the process properly and the importance of the assessment? We found some disconnect here, where in a few cases, staff haven't necessarily appreciated the importance of this assessment. Consistency of approach, particularly where line managers have responsibility, and that there has been some moderation exercises to ensure consistent standards across the firm. Some individuals have felt exposed in making a final decision, particularly if it's a difficult case. And whilst we've not seen significant failures, what happens, as Julie mentioned earlier, if a firm believes it can't issue a certificate to an individual? Firstly, is the reason sufficiently important that a notification to the regulator is required, and of course the individual? We've seen some firms form a people committee. This might already be in existence, for instance, for disciplinary matters. But again, we can see HR, compliance and legal working together with the business to deal with escalated issues and ensure consistency of approach. This is where a firm may introduce a performance improvement plan to try and get the individual back on track. We've seen some firms using a conditional sign-off with a development plan, where potentially the F&P certificate is restricted to current functions, but there's an anticipation that the role may change, and so the certificate may have a shorter period than 12 months. Significant debate on what is and isn't a breach, and the amount of time that such issues take to resolve, particularly where it's not clear-cut as to whether an issue is truly a conduct matter, comes down to what firms expect from a conduct perspective, i.e., for instance, failure to complete mandatory training within the appropriate timescale. The impact that such a decision can have on an individual and their regulatory reference is not to be underestimated. And it is probably fair to say these issues are taking a lot longer for firms to land on a decision, given it's the first time the new regime has been used from an F&P perspective on a major scale. Okay, so the regime, as Simon mentioned earlier, has been in place now since March. So, what are the sort of typical queries that we've been seeing? And how have firms adapted and adopted important approaches? Well, first one, around absences. What to do with absences given the 4-week rule? Remembering it's designed for unforeseen circumstances and means an individual can step into a certified role for up to 4 weeks without being certified unless it's a role requiring a qualification. Where someone is likely to cover for over that period, due for instance to longer term incapacity, then early assessment of their F&P is likely to be needed. Or, potentially, a discussion with the regulator depending on the circumstances. Role sharing. Official job share is fine, but making sure roles are clear, just as they are, for senior managers given their statements of responsibility, and that the individual and the senior line manager fully appreciate what the role involves. When to escalate, what is material, what is serious, what isn't, and the speed at which escalation takes place. The regulator judges escalation as a measure of good culture. How promptly a firm or an individual deals with an issue can say a lot about culturally how the firm deals with its problems. Handling the differences between proper whistleblowing incidents and grievances, training, increased profile, whistleblowing champions oversight, and trying to pitch the messaging right to ensure the new requirements have the right gravitas but provide a clear approach to ensure people know the difference between a grievance and genuine whistleblowing, and the in-house teams tasked with managing the issues have the right tools and knowledge. The extent to which firms need to look at personal characteristics, given the specific reference in fit, where an individual has a managerial or supervisory function, do they have the right characteristics to undertake the role? Firms need to look at the performance management measures they use, behavioural analysis, psychometric testing, etc., remembering that historically the regulators have demonstrated what poor behaviours can lead to with the crisis issues of mis-selling and market manipulation. So, in terms then of my final slide today, enforcing the new regime, and is it time to worry? We think overall there's obviously been a general welcome for the removal of the so-called reverse burden of proof. But we're beginning to see the regulator referencing the SMCR in correspondence with firms, particularly where serious issues have arisen and the regulator is looking to take action, for instance, in relation to a skilled person review. The regulator is reminding firms of the overall responsibility, but most notably the responsibilities and accountabilities of senior managers and a focus on delegation of activities to certified individuals. Key is being able to demonstrate the rationale for decisions, as Julie mentioned earlier. The regulators don't expect that there are never errors or mistakes. Firms do make wrong decisions, as we all do, but it is being able to demonstrate reasonable steps that it is important, and an obvious way of doing that is recording the detailed rationale behind decisions. This would normally be the case with well-documented board or committee minutes. But individuals are accountable, so they should be comfortable that the minutes do provide the complete record. We will no doubt start to see the regulators beginning to supervise the regime through potential thematics. They've already given their 6-month feedback in a number of areas in September. And fit and proper assessments are likely to be an area of scrutiny as the regulator seeks to benchmark firms, and importantly, their senior managers and certified individuals. And on that note, I'm going to hand back over to Philip.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon. That's really informative. We've certainly got a number of questions coming in already, so please do not hesitate to send your questions in. The questions are completely anonymous. We won't mention your name or your organisation's name. We've got one question already. I understand that this presentation relates to certification staff, but does the panel consider that F&P work that is undertaken for certified staff extends to SMFs, as the SMF annual fit and proper assessment appears to require a similar level of investigation and evidence required? Have the panel observed what firms are doing in this space, and if they are also issuing similar certificates to SMFs for governance purposes?
Hi, Philip, thanks. Julie speaking. I'll pick this one up first from the experience that we've had recently. It's been quite interesting as firms have looked at the different populations that sit in the senior management population and then in certification. They've been working out what's the best route to go, and what we've seen is that firms have undertaken, obviously, the F&P for the senior managers at outset, and then what firms tend to seem to be doing is to go through a process whereby annually they won't certificate their senior managers because there's no requirement for them to do so, but they will do an annual check, maybe in full every 3 years. In the intervening years between those full checks, a self-assessment questionnaire where an individual will go through the process and say, has anything changed or have I got anything to declare over and above what happened in the previous year? If the answer to that is yes, then they flip back through to a full annual assessment again. If the answer is no, then they're not on a shortened annual assessment, but with the firm reserving the right to sample like a professional body would do with CPD, where they'll maybe check 20% of their people on a random sample just to make sure that everybody is disclosing what they should do. So that's certainly been my experience.
Yeah, and to add on to that, Julie, what we've also seen, some of the challenge actually is around who is assessing the SMS as to some degree fit and proper as well. So making the governance connection as well, and it's a very important role here for the chair in terms of how that works, the use of the remuneration committees as well. I think that we've seen a number of firms try as best they can to adopt a similar approach to S&P across both populations, notwithstanding the fact that it does have to be tweaked to suit the particularly any conflict areas as well that may occur with the SMS.
And taking us off onto a slightly different tangent, the EBA and ESMA is currently consulting on guidelines about how institutions, banks, should determine whether their senior management functions are effectively, to use the UK term, fit and proper. So although CRD requires banks to assess the members of their senior management body effectively, the EBA and ESMA guidelines are looking perhaps to extend this requirement out into key function areas, basically CROs, CFOs, heads of internal audits, heads of compliance. So there is some overlap in terms of fit and properness assessment in relation to some thoughts that have been going on in Europe as well.
Okay, next question has come in. Our HR has accepted that we will not reach 100% certification because of employees on maternity leave, long-term sick, etc. Is this right? Should we ensure 100% of roles are certified?
That's a really interesting and quite a challenging question there. I think it's fair to say that if somebody is on maternity and long-term sick, you won't have the up-to-date relevant records to actually say, are they currently fit and proper to do that role? So actually it would be very difficult to do so. However, if somebody's just gone on long-term sick and you have all of the data from your annual performance appraisal, your credit checking that you may be employing, and any P&C requirements, then possibly you could. However, more realistically is that you would do that at the point that the person returns to work through some kind of assessment process. Yeah. There's the ability to be able to certificate people for less than 12 months. So at whatever point they come back into the system, you can go through a certification process with them, certificate them until you put them back into the annual cycle that everybody else sits in. But from a systems perspective, I would expect that's probably what people would do.
Mm. And I concur totally with that. It is a difficult and tricky situation. But if you have people out on long-term sick, that is difficult to do anything else other than that approach. And if there's a particular issue, I think the key thing is somebody else undertaking that role, that certified role, and therefore you haven't got gaps. I think where the regulator gets concerned perhaps is if there are gaps in who is undertaking those certified roles, similarly with SMF roles as well.
And fitness and proper extending to NEDs of regulated firms, same procedures, same rules?
Certainly, a couple of firms I've been working with have, again, back to my previous comment, across the board as a whole. And I think this comes back to some of the concerns that have been driven out from the regime, that it was perhaps looking at the way the approach was creating a two-tier board. I think a lot of that has now been dispelled, and I think that what firms, and certainly perhaps now bringing in conduct rules for the notified NEDs, as Simon was mentioning as well, I think there's firms trying to have a degree of consistency across. They all have a vital role to play within the overall governance of the firm, and therefore a relatively consistent approach to F&P is probably the best way.
So what you're saying there, Simon, is that although there's no regulatory requirement to do it, in the interest of treating everybody the same.
Yes, and also from a point of view of good corporate governance. And I think this is where the regulator has also commented on, we've got to look at the varying aspects that a board director, NED or executive actually signs up to in any event, from corporate governance code, from fiduciary responsibilities, as well as obviously the senior manager's regime as well.
Yeah, good one. No, thanks. Please keep your questions coming in. Some fantastic ones. One of the questions: how do you assess and evidence personal characteristics? That's a nice easy one, isn't it? It's really simple.
Julia, do you want to?
I'm going to start with the simplest point here is that personal characteristics. So when I apply for a role and you check my references and my qualifications, does everything match up? So do I tell you what it is and how it is? Absolutely. Personal characteristics, certainly for people that are members of professional bodies. Certainly some of our professional bodies I can think of require ethics testing for their members. So in terms of personal integrity, people can demonstrate that through other sources. But it's a combination of things, isn't it? It's a positive employment record, it's factual information that is correct, it's through interview, challenging people through competency assessment questions to challenge that. It's not just one thing, in my opinion.
And mentioning that EBA ESMA consultation paper, as I think in Appendix A there are a number of factors that during that assessment process institutions should think about assessing. So there's an interesting, it's not a checklist, but it's factors that should be taken into account in that CP, which might be helpful.
Yes, and similar. What I've tended to see is firms just looking at what they've got in their existing appraisal arrangements and the extent to which they do go to in terms of, for instance, psychometric testing. I've seen firms adopting that further, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, where that individual has some form of supervisory role and linking it, and certainly the regulators looked at linking this into some of the performance management thematics as well that have come through. Again, trying to look at joining the dots, and I was talking to the regulators the other week actually, and this is something that they are very keen to get across actually, around the fact that the FMR shouldn't be looked at in isolation. It links into a lot of the other areas of regulation that are going on and some of the thematics that they are doing. So it is a question of trying to, for instance, join the dots between that, the performance management, and whistleblowing as well, to make sure, again, you haven't got a culture whereby perhaps individuals can be accused of bullying and so on and so forth. And that is really where I think this has been aimed at, coming out of the libel scandals and some of the other issues as well.
Okay, good question coming in now. How detailed or lengthy should the actual certificate that is issued to the individual be?
Again, another interesting question, and one that we've spent some time actually at WorkSmart working on with our clients. If we look at what the regulator has given, it's certainly all guidance in this area as opposed to rules. And when those certificates are issued, what the regulator is looking for, certainly in our interpretation, is that the individual is confirmed as certificated for any number, i.e. one or more, of the significant harm functions. And then in addition to that, just basically some broad information about the activities and the role that the individual is going to perform within an organisation. Certainly in the work that we've done with our clients, we have organised it so that people will be able to certificate against the specific significant harm function and also just a broad statement about that individual's activities. But I think it's just worth noting here as well that some of your people will sit in more than one of those significant harm functions. So the certificate should cover all that the individual is covered for and do it all in one certificate. It doesn't necessarily need to be separate.
And following on from that, what would an F&P certificate look like? Is that an in-house document?
Yes, I think firms that are, I'm sure there's lots of different types of certificates out there, and we've seen a variety of different ones. A lot of firms, in all honesty, have already had some form of ongoing assessment, obviously, that they are doing. And therefore, it's not a question necessarily of reinventing the wheel, but actually looking quite carefully at what's in place already and then tweaking that to reflect the enhanced requirements. But we've tended to see the certificate itself being relatively brief, but linking into the background information that supports what the decision process has been and the evidence.
Okay, good question coming in here. The particular challenges relating to certifying overseas resources. What particular challenges have people or organisations encountered? First question. Second question, have particular challenges been encountered in trying to apply IAR requirements to contingent workers who, under the regulatory definition of an employer, are subject to IAR? I think we've worked with a number of foreign banks and talking about these issues.
Yeah, that's quite a lengthy question, that, and I think there's a few different bits to it. So if I can take the first piece. So in terms of overseas individuals, we know that in terms of certification, if they are operating with UK clients, that they're actually, if they fall into the definitions, they're going to be in certification. I think from what I've seen, probably the greatest challenge has been people working out who is in their certification population per se, as opposed to saying, actually, I have an issue because this person's overseas. Haven't particularly seen that come through. And you'll have to remind me of the second part of the question now, Philip, because it was quite a long one.
Second part, have particular challenges been encountered in trying to apply IAR requirements to contingent workers who, under regulated definition of an employee, are subject to IAR?
Yeah. So from that perspective, again, if the contingent worker is undertaking a role that is required, then they have to be certified. Similarly with an SMF role, in fact, if you've got a temporary workforce or contracting or however that works, then if they're fulfilling the function,
even interims.
Absolutely, because ultimately, and this is quite interesting, it's the definition of employee. Ultimately, it comes down to, and of course, we're looking at the regulator's definition of an employee, which is someone where the firm exercises some degree of supervision or control. So it's irrelevant almost what the employment contract, whether it's a contract of service or a contract for services, that's to some degree irrelevant to the role that they're doing.
Julie, in terms of is it the 30-day rule which allows somebody from overseas to come in and work in the UK in what would otherwise be a certified role? How are you finding your clients actually doing the totting up of that 30 days? Because presumably people come in for a week and then another couple of days, and perhaps before Wimbledon they come back for 5 days. I don't know.
And I think that's is a really good point. And if I'm honest, I'm not convinced that everybody has got that far down the road to think about how that might work. But I think the key here, it goes back to the point I made earlier about the fact that if you've got a large population, or even if you haven't got a large certification population, over time, the burden of records and managing is going to be complex. So unless you've got some fairly robust systems and controls around it, actually when the regulator asks you that question and says, how many people have you got that have operated from overseas here on that rule, actually you'll find it very difficult to be able to answer that question.
In terms of demonstrating the assessment of CP's skills, knowledge and expertise, are CPs expected to explain, brackets, in writing, every year how they demonstrated these skills, knowledge and experience, even though they have not changed?
Well, I think ultimately what we'll see to some degree as this regime really does bed in what expectations for that sort of ongoing aspect is there where things haven't changed. But in simple terms, what we tend to see is individuals needing to reflect on what they have been doing over that period and to have the evidence again as part and parcel of the overall assessment that they're collating to maintain that they're keeping up to date and they're keeping competent. And there is, to some degree, a responsibility personally to ensure that that's happening. So I think the key for me on this is that this regime came in on 7th of March this year. Firms have got to be slightly aware that the overall aspect is continuous enhancement to some degree of competence. And it's a developing thing. The regulator and PRA I've spoken to, they're looking at this as a longer term process to just improve standards, get that trust back within the industry. So individuals have to buy into that as well. So this is where it's trying to remove the aspect of a sort of tick box approach. Yes, I've done that, and therefore I can move on.
You're clearly not letting up as an audience, even though it's quite a few days till Christmas. So I'm going to give it another long question, but I think is a very pertinent one. Quarter certification is F&P assessment. The FIT test is very wide and looks at honesty, integrity, reputation, competence, capability. What is the view on issues that are not directly of a regulatory nature? For example, employers guilty of bullying, harassment, etc., or have been found to be being dishonest as part of an internal disciplinary or grievance scenario. Where is the sensible bar? One view would be that these issues do not properly go to F&P in the regulatory sense, but are wider by the letter analysts could mean that these issues resulted in a person not being certified.
I've had a couple of instances where this has been an issue that's been raised, and ultimately it falls back on what the firm considers to be fit and proper and how it's going to assess individuals. So for argument's sake, if, for instance, a firm uses as part and parcel of its process for instance, integrity and assessing that, outside business interests might not have a direct impact on their regulatory role, but if the individual, as part of the firm's in-house process, has signed up for that and doesn't declare an outside interest, then that could potentially call into, depending on the circumstances, obviously, that individual's fit and properness. Because it's that individual. And if they're being, for argument's sake, economical with the truth on that aspect, how could that impact in their role overall? So it's in these important, very important roles, top roles within the firm and the organisation, then that wider piece is relevant. Obviously subject, and I know a number of firms that have a very, very tough line on this, that almost, for instance, failure to undertake mandatory training, to 3 strikes in a year, and that's it.
Okay.
So I think it's very much what does the firm sign up to, and if they're imposing a requirement on an individual to, for argument's sake, disclose certain things or certain types of behaviour, and that person breaches those requirements, then fit and proper is called into question.
Yes. I'm going to, sorry to cut you off, Julie. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to go through these really, really quickly. Do you have any advice as to how firms can demonstrate that the entire firm's population has been notified that they will be subject to the conduct rules from March, especially how it applies to their roles? So this may be informative communications, internal communications, and training as well.
So what organisations would typically have, and what I've seen certainly in terms of conduct rules, is that at a senior level, so the senior manager function holders, typically the conduct rules training has been very scenario-based and it's been face-to-face. This has been followed up probably by some communications in terms of the slight change in the Tier 1 and Tier 2 conduct rules that apply to them. For the other staff, typically firms have employed in-house training within banking, maybe Tuesday, Wednesday morning training sessions where the network branches are closed, and they have training packs where they'll deliver out that training, slide decks on intranet sites, maybe e-learning. So there's a whole host of evidence that a firm can gather to evidence that, but I would suspect that the evidence that would confirm that all is possibly a slight change in terms of the employment contract, because there'll be something in there about breaching conduct rules and the implications of.
Okay, do you have any advice in assessing the competence of the following? 5.2.41 managers of certification employees. I'll leave that to you, Julie, whilst I ask the next question.
Thank you. Okay, so in CISC then, we know that the 5.2.41 is the managers of certification employees. So assessing the competence of those is obviously going to be, you're going to have an annual performance process, and that annual performance process is likely to differ for managers. Simon's referenced it earlier on, that there's, you would potentially look at different measures. So as a manager of individuals, you're going to look at certain behavioural competencies and certain expectations of me that would be slightly different than one of an individual that would report to me. So I would suspect it would be a higher level, more complex, annual appraisal performance review that would feed into certification. And it may well be that that individual may be a member of a professional body again, so there may be some evidence that you would gather there in terms of their competence and capability.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So another very good but long question. Okay, right. Is this webinar going to be recorded? I can answer that one. Yes, it is, and the slides will be distributed straight away post-haste. An on-demand version of the recording will also be available for playback as well for those colleagues of yours who haven't been able to record or dial into the live webinar as well. If a T&C supervisor is different to a line manager, i.e. split supervision, are both subject to certification if managing CF30 teams?
That's an interesting question in terms of under the requirements that are set out in CISC, it's functions requiring qualifications and managers of certified people. So I would ask the question, is the T&C supervisor falling into something that needs to have a qualification?
Yeah. If they do, then they're in.
Yeah.
And if they don't, then they're probably not.
Okay. What happens if a CEO in a small bank with a wide range of SMS is suddenly incapacitated such that he or she is expected to be unable to perform their role for an extended period?
Well, in essence, the regulator will not wish to see such a gap. So the firm has an issue. It is a difficult one to deal with, but for instance, somebody, and we've seen quite a lot of pressure come to bear from the regulators to say the firm has to look at how it will actually resolve this, and it might have to be an interim situation whereby experienced individuals are brought in initially perhaps on a contract basis, and we've seen this happen in the past. But the regulator, determined by the sheer number that they're taking of a senior management function, unless there are other people who can take on those roles within the SMS universe, if it's a very small organisation, that's probably unlikely, in which case certainly that interim scenario, no matter how difficult that may be, might be the sole option there. I don't know, Simon, if you've got a...
No direct experience, but I think you're absolutely right, Simon. The FCA and the PRA are going to expect to have somebody doing that job. You've got to find someone to fill that person's shoes.
I think exactly. It's akin to why they've asked for responsibility maps, so that there aren't any gaps in the overall governance, and a problem can't arise. Whether or not some of the certified qualified individuals would be able to, for instance, step up. And you do have the 12-week rule as well for SMS from that perspective. But if it's going to be a long-term incapacity, in any event, you want to begin talking to the regulator about what plans, what contingency plans, what succession plans. And that there begs the question, what do you already have in place from a succession aspect and contingency plan aspect?
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to our panel. It's been a very informative discussion. I'm sure that lots of notes taken. We haven't had time to answer all the questions, unfortunately, but the presenters have very kindly said that they will take these questions offline and respond to you directly. You'll see on the last slide that both Simon and Julie have left their email addresses for you to contact them directly. We do apologise for last week's inconvenience. In no shape or form was it reflective of Eversheds or our colleagues at WorkSmart for the technology issues there. But thank you very much indeed, and have a very Merry Christmas indeed. Thank you. Good afternoon.